There is a conversation happening in your garden right now. You are not part of it. You are, however, the subject of it. The magpie that watched you from the fence post this morning did not keep what it knows to itself. It couldn't, even if it wanted to, because that is not how magpies work. What it has learned about you through weeks of observation and assessment has been transmitted to other magpies in neighboring gardens, along boundaries you have never thought to consider. There are birds in gardens you have never visited that already have a profile of you. They have never seen your face. They know it anyway. Welcome to Garden Bird Secrets. If you're new here, subscribe, because what you're about to learn will change every morning you spend in your garden. In the first video in this series, we established that the magpie in your garden knows your face, individually, precisely, and across years. What we didn't cover is what it does with that knowledge. Today, we're going to look at 5 things science has found about how that information travels, how long it lasts, and what it ultimately means for how the birds in your neighborhood regard you right now, this morning, without your knowledge. Stay until the end. Because the 5th point is the one that changes everything. There is an old English expression, to chatter like a magpie. For centuries, it described someone who talked too much and said nothing of consequence. The magpie's call became, in British folk memory, the sound of noise without meaning, gossip, chatter. The bird that could not stop talking and said nothing worth hearing. But British people have always felt that the magpie's chatter was directed at them, not past them. Something in it seemed intentional. Something seemed to be communicated, even if no one could say what. This is something British people have felt for centuries. Now we have language for why. When the magpie on your fence sees you step outside, it calls. You've heard that call. Most people assume it is a general alarm, the bird equivalent of a smoke detector. Loud, indiscriminate, meaning little more than something is here. It means considerably more than that. Research from the University of Cambridge has documented that corvid alarm calls are not single, undifferentiated sounds. They are structured. They encode specific information, the type of threat, the direction it is moving, and the level of urgency required in response. The birds listening are not just alerted, they are briefed. The call your magpie makes when it sees you is not the same call it makes for a sparrowhawk overhead, or a cat moving through the hedge, or a stranger it has never assessed. Each of those produces a measurably different vocal response. In your garden, this means that every bird within range of that call, every blue tit at the feeder, every robin in the hedge, receives information specific to you the moment you appear. They know, from the structure of that call alone, roughly what kind of presence you represent. The next time you hear your magpie call as you walk outside, understand that something is being said about you, in detail. There's a particular thing that happens in gardens where someone has built trust with the birds over time, and it is easy to overlook because it happens in the absence of something rather than the presence of it. You step outside. The magpie is there, as it often is. It looks at you, as it always does, and it doesn't call. The blue tits continue feeding. The robin holds its perch. The garden stays audibly the same as it was before you appeared. What you just witnessed is not nothing. That silence, that absence of the alarm, is itself a transmission. The birds around you were informed that you arrived. They were informed that no particular response was required. You were vouched for. You just didn't know the language it was done in. But the silence, or the call, only reaches so far. The birds that can hear it are one thing. What about the birds that weren't there to hear it at all? This is the point that stops most people. The young magpies you will see in your garden for the first time this summer, born this year, hatched in a nest you never found, still wearing the slightly duller plumage of their first season, have already received preliminary information about you. They have never looked directly at your face. You have never given them cause for alarm or reason for reassurance, and yet they arrive in your garden carrying an assessment that was formed before they could fly. Research from the University of Washington, the foundational work by Professor John Marzluff and his colleagues on corvid facial recognition, demonstrated something that fundamentally changed how ornithologists think about social learning in birds. Juvenile crows, with no direct negative experience of a specific human, displayed full threat avoidance behavior toward that person's face. The knowledge had transferred, through behavior, through vocalization, through the simple act of juveniles watching how adults responded. Magpies share the corvid family's capacity for exactly this kind of social transmission. In your garden, this means that your history with the local magpie population does not begin when you first make eye contact with a bird. It begins when the adults in the area first form a view of you. And that view enters a network that extends far beyond what you can see from your kitchen window. The young magpie watching you from the apple tree has been told what to think about you. What it was told depends entirely on what you did before it arrived, which raises a question worth sitting with. Exactly how far does that telling reach? How many birds in how many gardens are part of this exchange? Most people think of the magpie in their garden as their magpie, a single bird, or perhaps a pair, with a defined territory that ends somewhere around the hedge. The reality is structurally different. Data from the British Trust for Ornithology's long-term garden bird surveys reveals the magpie population density in UK suburban areas. In a typical residential neighborhood, the overlapping ranges of magpie pairs create a continuous network, not a series of isolated territories, but a web of connected individuals whose ranges intersect, overlap, and share common boundary zones. Research into corvid social network structure, published in the Royal Society's journals and built on fieldwork across UK urban and suburban sites, has mapped how information moves through these networks. Dominant breeding pairs hold central positions. Floater individuals, younger birds without established territories, move through multiple ranges. Boundary zones between pairs are not barriers. They are meeting points. Stay with me, because this next part changes everything. In your garden, this means that the magpie you see most mornings is connected, through overlapping range, through shared boundary, through social familiarity, to between 4 and 8 other individuals whose ranges touch yours. What it knows about you is accessible to all of them. Your garden is not a boundary, it is a junction point. The information your magpie holds about you, the vocal cues it has filed, the assessments it has made, the status it has assigned you, sits at the center of a small but densely connected social web. You are a known quantity across an area considerably larger than your own garden fence. And people almost always ask at this point, understandably so, whether any of this lasts. Surely, over winter, over distance, over the 100 other things a magpie has to attend to, the record fades. There is a common assumption about animal memory, that it fades. That whatever impression you made on the magpie last spring has softened over winter, worn down by distance and time and other things to attend to. This assumption is wrong. Professor Nicola Clayton's laboratory at the University of Cambridge has spent 2 decades documenting what corvids are capable of remembering, and what they remember is not merely who, but when, where, and in what condition. The research on episodic-like memory in corvids, the capacity to remember not just facts, but experiences, not just identities, but events, has established that corvid memory does not simply store impressions. It stores context. What this means for the magpie in your garden is this. It is not carrying a faded photograph of you. It is carrying a file. And that file does not sit unchanged from one encounter to the next. It is updated. Each time you step outside, each time you move through the garden, each time you look at the fence post where it sits, that data is incorporated. The assessment is revised. In your garden, this means that every interaction you have had with your magpie, however small, however unremarkable it felt at the time, has contributed to a record that is neither fading nor static. You are not being observed, you are being documented. The question worth sitting with is not whether the record exists. It does. The question is what kind of record it is, and whether the entries you have made in it over time have been working for you or against you. Everything we have covered so far has described a system for transmitting threat, the alarm call that encodes your identity, the juveniles learning your status before they've met you, the network that extends your profile beyond your garden boundary, the memory that updates but does not fade. These mechanisms evolved for survival, to protect corvid communities from danger. That is what they are for. But here is what Marzluff's research, and the subsequent work built on it, ultimately revealed. The same mechanism that transmits threat, the same social learning, the same network, the same long-term memory, also transmits the absence of threat. When a person has behaved predictably and safely over time, when the alarm call made in their presence has consistently been a low-urgency signal or no signal at all, that information travels through the network in precisely the same way. The juveniles arriving in your garden do not only inherit warnings, they inherit reassurances. The Marzluff data contains something that receives less attention than the threat response findings, that the human subjects who received the harshest initial responses were eventually, over months, over changed behavior, reclassified. The crows updated their threat assessment downward. The caution they had transmitted to others was replaced gradually by a different signal. In your garden, this means that the magpie on your fence is not only a surveillance asset, it is, potentially, a character witness. If it has decided, through weeks of early mornings and unremarkable afternoons and the slow accumulation of ordinary moments, that you are not a threat, that assessment has entered the network. There are birds in neighboring gardens that regard you as safe, and you have never done anything to earn that directly. If you've ever stood in your garden and felt genuinely watched, you were not imagining it. But if you've ever felt somehow that you were accepted, that there was something in the way a bird held its ground as you approached, something in a silence that seemed like trust rather than indifference, you were not imagining that either. I want to tell you about something that happens, occasionally, that most garden owners file under coincidence because they don't have another category for it. A new magpie appears in a garden. Not the familiar one, a different bird, younger, from a direction you haven't seen a magpie come from before. You've done nothing to introduce yourself to it. You haven't offered food, made no particular gesture of goodwill. You are simply there, in the garden, doing what you usually do. And the bird doesn't leave. It watches you, as magpies do. But it doesn't call, doesn't alarm, doesn't keep the careful, escalating distance of a bird encountering an unknown quantity for the first time. It maintains a moderate distance and simply observes. Not threat assessment, something closer to curiosity. There is, as far as current science can confirm, one plausible explanation for that. The bird is not meeting you for the first time. It is meeting you with prior knowledge. Knowledge that came from the network. Knowledge that traveled along social connections from a bird, your bird, that had already formed a view. The new magpie is not cautious because it has been told, in whatever form corvid social transmission takes, that caution is not required. I'm not going to tell you what that means about the relationship you've built, or whether relationship is even the right word for something that operates on these terms. But I don't think you were wrong to notice it. Has a magpie, or any garden bird, ever responded to you in a way you couldn't quite explain? A silence where you expected alarm. A bird that held its ground when it had no reason to. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. These are the stories I carry with me longest. In the next video in this series, we'll go deeper into what the magpie's memory holds across years and what remains of it when the bird itself is gone. I'll see you in the garden.